Every single American invasion in the last 35 years followed the exact same playbook. First came the airstrikes, then the press conferences, then a retired general sitting on CNN telling you this would be over quickly, and then, always then, the ground troops arrived. Kuwait in 1991, Afghanistan in 2001, Iraq in 2003. The air campaign was never the war. The air campaign was always the opening act, and if you've lived through any of those conflicts, you already know what comes next, even if the people on your television screen are pretending they don't. Right now, 25 days into Operation Epic Fury, 5 specific and historically reliable signals are telling anyone who knows where to look that the next act is about to begin. Not in months, not in weeks, in days. And I need you to sit with that for a moment before we go any further. What I'm about to walk you through is not political commentary, and it is not a conspiracy theory. These are 5 documented, trackable, verifiable indicators, the same indicators that intelligence analysts, military planners, and defense journalists use to distinguish between a contained air campaign and the preparation phase of a full-scale ground invasion. Every single one of them is active right now, and when I say every single one, I mean that the last time all 5 of these signals fired simultaneously was January 2003, roughly 6 weeks before American tanks crossed the Kuwaiti border into Iraq. You remember how that turned out? Now here's what most people miss. If you're watching cable news right now, you're being told a story about precision airstrikes, surgical targeting, and the steady degradation of Iranian nuclear capability. And that story is not false. Those strikes are happening. Those targets are being hit. But that framing hides the bigger picture the same way it hid the bigger picture 23 years ago. Because while the cameras are pointed at explosions and missile launches, the logistics behind the camera are moving in a completely different direction. Ships are repositioning, bases are expanding, diplomats are packing their bags, and the language coming out of Washington is shifting in ways that only make sense if the planning has already moved past the air campaign and into what comes after it. 5 predictions, 5 signals, all active at the same time. Let me walk you through each one and you can decide for yourself what they add up to. But first, you need to understand why a ground invasion becomes the logical next move in a sequence that has already begun, because this does not come out of nowhere. Operation Epic Fury launched on February 28, 2026, with over 900 strikes in the first 12 hours. Supreme Leader Khamenei was assassinated alongside his daughter, his son-in-law, and his grandchildren in the opening salvo. The Strait of Hormuz has been closed since March 2nd. Over 5,000 targets have been struck inside Iran in the 25 days since. The air campaign by any measure has been one of the most intensive sustained bombardments since the opening weeks of the Iraq War. And here is the problem that no one at the Pentagon will say on camera but that every honest military analyst understands privately. The air campaign has been devastating, and it has not worked. Iran's Mosaic defense, the decentralized, semi-autonomous military system we covered in detail in previous videos, was designed from the ground up to survive exactly this kind of assault. Regional IRGC commanders hold their own orders and their own operational plans. Military infrastructure sits buried inside the Zagros and Alborz mountain ranges where cruise missiles and precision-guided munitions cannot reliably reach. The strait remains closed. Drones are still launching. The proxy network continues activating across Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon. 25 days of sustained bombardment and the strategic situation on the ground has not fundamentally changed. The IRGC is still fighting, the strait is still shut, and American objectives remain unmet. When air power fails to achieve its stated objectives, American military doctrine prescribes one response: escalation to ground operations. That is not my opinion. That is not speculation. That is how the American military has operated in every major conflict since the Korean War. The Air Force softens the target. The ground force takes the ground. The same playbook, executed the same way, every single time. So here are the 5 signals that tell you the next phase is not a question of if, it is a question of when. and when appears to be very soon. Prediction number 1. The naval deployment has shifted from airstrike support to amphibious forced entry positioning. This is the single most important signal on the list, and it requires you to understand one critical distinction that changes the entire picture: the difference between what aircraft carriers do and what amphibious assault ships do. The USS Gerald R. Ford and USS Harry S. Truman carrier strike groups have been operating in the Arabian Sea for weeks. Carriers launch aircraft, they conduct bombing runs, they project air power from the ocean. That is their job, and they have been doing it. 2 carrier strike groups in one theater is significant but not unprecedented for a sustained air campaign. What changed the calculation was the arrival of the USS Bataan, a Wasp-class amphibious assault ship, in the Gulf of Oman during the second week of March. The Bataan is carrying approximately 2,200 Marines from the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit. Now pay close attention here, because this distinction matters more than anything else I will say in this video. An amphibious assault ship is not an airstrike platform. It is a troop delivery system. Its entire reason for existing is putting Marines on a hostile coastline. It carries landing craft, helicopters, Osprey tilt-rotor aircraft, and amphibious assault vehicles, none of which serve any purpose whatsoever in an air campaign. Zero. You don't load 2,200 Marines onto an amphibious assault ship and sail it into a war zone to watch airstrikes from the deck. You load them because you intend to land them somewhere. The USS Arlington, a San Antonio-class amphibious transport dock, moved into the region alongside the Bataan, carrying additional Marine forces, armored vehicles, and heavy equipment. USNI News Fleet Tracking confirmed both vessels in theater by mid-March. 2 amphibious warfare ships operating simultaneously represents a deliberate assembly of forced entry capability, the kind of capability you assemble when you intend to put forces onto a shore that doesn't want them there. On top of that, the Department of Defense authorized the deployment of an additional 12,000 troops to Central Command's area of responsibility in the first 2 weeks of March alone. That is separate from the personnel already stationed at existing bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE. Military logistics analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies noted explicitly that this deployment pace mirrors the build-up pattern observed in the 60 days preceding the 2003 Iraq invasion, not the pattern associated with sustained air operations. Let those numbers land properly. When the Navy moves carriers, it is projecting power. When the Navy moves amphibious assault ships loaded with Marines and armored vehicles into a war zone, it is preparing to use them. That distinction is worth more than every press briefing the Pentagon has given in the last 3 weeks combined. Prediction number 2. Forward operating bases across the Gulf are expanding at a pace that only makes sense if ground forces are about to stage through them. This one requires you to look past the headlines and into the logistics, because logistics tell you what a military is actually planning to do, regardless of what its spokespeople say it's planning to do. The old military saying is relevant here: amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics, and right now, the logistics are screaming. Satellite imagery analyzed by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and reported across multiple defense publications shows significant new construction at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, Ali Al Salem Air Base in Kuwait, and Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE over the past 3 weeks. New temporary structures consistent with troop housing, vehicle staging areas, and field hospital configurations have appeared at all 3 installations. Here's the distinction you need to understand. An air base supporting bombing operations needs fuel storage, munitions depots, and aircraft maintenance hangars. A staging base preparing for ground force deployment needs all of that, plus barracks for thousands of additional personnel, motor pools for armored vehicles and transport trucks, mass casualty medical triage facilities rated for the kind of injuries ground combat produces, and logistics distribution centers capable of sustaining tens of thousands of troops over months. The construction patterns visible at these 3 bases match the ground force staging profile. not the air campaign support profile. The 101st Airborne Division, based at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, has been placed on deployment alert according to Military Times reporting. And that fact alone deserves its own moment of attention. The 101st is not a unit you activate for airstrikes. It is a rapid deployment division designed to seize and hold territory, establish forward operating positions, and conduct offensive ground operations in hostile environments. Its legacy deployments read like a list of every major American ground war of the last 80 years: Normandy, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Afghanistan, Iraq. When the 101st gets the call, someone is going somewhere on foot. That is what the 101st does. That is all the 101st does. Pre-positioned equipment stocks at Camp Arifjan in Kuwait, the largest American forward logistics base in the Middle East, have been drawn down according to U.S. Army logistics tracking. Pre-positioned stocks exist for exactly one reason: to equip ground forces faster than those forces could bring their own equipment from the continental United States. The stocks include armored vehicles, trucks, ammunition, engineering equipment, and field medical supplies. Drawing them down means someone expects to use them, and expects to use them soon. You do not pull pre-positioned equipment out of climate-controlled storage in the Kuwaiti desert for a precautionary inventory check during an active conflict. Prediction number 3. The diplomatic evacuation pattern has activated. This signal is quieter than the military ones. It does not make the front page, it does not come with satellite imagery or fleet tracking maps, but historically, it has been the single most reliable predictor of imminent ground operations. Every major American ground invasion in the last 40 years was preceded by a drawdown of diplomatic personnel from neighboring countries. The logic is straightforward. Ground war creates regional escalation risk that extends beyond the borders of the country being invaded. That risk endangers civilian government employees, and the State Department moves those people out before the escalation begins. On March 14th, the State Department issued an ordered departure notice for non-essential personnel at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. This was not a travel advisory. It was not voluntary. It was an ordered departure. Personnel were directed to leave, not offered the option. On the same day, the travel advisory level for Iraq was elevated to level 4, the highest designation the State Department issues, which reads simply, "Do not travel." The U.S. Embassy in Beirut issued a security alert on March 12th, urging all American citizens to depart Lebanon immediately, noting explicitly that commercial flight availability could not be guaranteed in the near term. The embassy in Amman, Jordan followed with a parallel alert 2 days later. Now here's the pattern recognition that matters. Prior to the 2003 Iraq invasion, the State Department ordered departures from embassies in Kuwait, Jordan, Syria, and Israel between January and February of 2003, approximately 30 to 45 days before ground operations commenced on March 20th. Prior to the 1991 Gulf War ground phase, embassy drawdowns in the region began approximately 3 weeks before the ground campaign launched on February 24th. The current drawdown pattern falls directly within that historical window. You can line up the dates side by side, and the overlap is uncomfortable in its precision. The British Foreign Office issued parallel travel warnings for Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan within 48 hours of the American notices. When your closest intelligence-sharing ally begins mirroring your evacuation timelines within 2 days, it is not a coincidence. It means they have been briefed on what the next phase involves. They know what is coming, and they are positioning their own people to be clear of it before it starts. Prediction number 4. The information warfare has shifted from containment framing to regime change framing. This one happens in plain sight while almost nobody notices the transition. And that's precisely what makes it effective. By the time the public recognizes the shift, the ground has already moved underneath the entire conversation. For the first 2 weeks of Operation Epic Fury, every briefing from the White House, the Pentagon, and the State Department used the same carefully calibrated vocabulary: targeted, proportionate, defensive, limited, degrading capability. These are containment words. They describe a bounded operation with a defined ceiling. They communicate to the public. This will not escalate. This has limits. This is under control. Starting around March 12th, the vocabulary changed. The National Security Advisor, appearing on a Sunday morning broadcast, used the phrase, "ensuring Iran can never threaten its neighbors again." Stop and sit with that sentence for a moment. Ensuring a country can never threaten its neighbors again is not a military objective you achieve with airstrikes. It is a permanent governance objective, one that requires removing the current regime and replacing it with something the United States considers acceptable. That is, regime change language, delivered on national television by one of the most senior national security officials in the government, and once those words are on the record, the policy window has already moved. The Secretary of Defense, speaking at a press conference on March 15th, referred to the need to fundamentally reshape the security architecture of the Persian Gulf region. You do not reshape a region's security architecture from 30,000 feet. You reshape it with boots on the ground, with occupation forces, with bases, and with years of sustained military commitment. Members of the Senate Armed Services Committee began using the phrase post-conflict Iran in public statements during the third week of March. Post-conflict language presumes a defined endpoint to the fighting and active planning for what follows: governance, reconstruction, stabilization, institution building. You do not plan for post-conflict governance of a country you intend to leave alone after the bombing stops. The media ecosystem moved in lockstep. Major outlets began running background pieces on Iranian opposition groups, detailed profiles of exile leaders, long-form analyses of Iran's ethnic composition, and the fracture lines that a post-invasion strategy might exploit: Kurds in the west, Azerbaijanis in the north, Arabs in Khuzestan, Baluch in the southeast, Turkmen along the northeastern border. This is the identical media preparation pattern that preceded the Iraq invasion. The public is being primed. A narrative framework is being constructed. And by the time the invasion announcement comes, the average viewer will have absorbed so much preparatory framing that the escalation feels natural, even inevitable, rather than what it actually is. A strategic choice with consequences that will last decades. Michael O'Hanlon, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, observed that when policy language shifts from verbs of limitation, contain, degrade, deter, to verbs of transformation, reshape, rebuild, ensure, the operational planning has already moved beyond the air campaign. That linguistic transition is not a prediction I'm making about the future. It has already happened. The words are already on the record. They cannot be unsaid. Prediction number 5. Reserve and National Guard mobilization has begun at a scale that makes no sense for an air campaign, and this is the hardest signal for any administration to conceal because it reaches directly into communities, into families, into kitchen table conversations in every state in the country. You cannot quietly mobilize tens of thousands of citizen soldiers without tens of thousands of families noticing. The Department of Defense authorized the mobilization of 10,000 Army Reserve and National Guard personnel in the first week of March. An additional authorization for 8,000 more was reported by the Associated Press on March 16th. That's 18,000 reserve component forces mobilized in 3 weeks. For comparison, the initial reserve mobilization preceding the 2003 Iraq invasion totaled approximately 37,000 in the first 60 days. The current pace, if sustained for another 3 to 4 weeks, would meet or exceed that number. Reserve forces serve a specific function in American military doctrine that active duty forces do not fill. Active duty troops handle the initial combat operations, the offensive maneuver, the high-intensity fighting, the initial seizure of territory. Reserve and National Guard units provide the sustainment layer that follows: logistics, supply chain management, medical support, military police, engineering, transportation, and civil affairs. These are the units that maintain an occupation over time, that keep supply lines open, that build and repair infrastructure, that manage the daily reality of controlling hostile territory. You do not mobilize 18,000 reservists to support an air campaign that active duty pilots and operators are already conducting from bases in the Gulf. You mobilize them because a ground presence is coming that active forces alone cannot sustain over the timeline the planners envision. Army Times reported that several Army National Guard engineer battalions received deployment orders specifying equipment loads consistent with route clearance operations and infrastructure repair. Capabilities you need when ground convoys are moving through hostile territory facing IED threats, not capabilities associated with air operations conducted from altitude. The activation of civil affairs units deserves particular attention because civil affairs teams are specifically trained for governance coordination, humanitarian assistance management, and population oversight in occupied territory. Their deployment means the planning chain has moved past the question of whether ground forces will deploy and into the operational question of what those forces will administer once they're on the ground. You do not activate civil affairs teams for a country you have no intention of occupying. Now step back from each signal individually and look at what they form when you lay them side by side. Because any single signal on its own could carry an alternative explanation. The Navy repositioning could be defensive posturing. The base expansion could be precautionary. The diplomatic drawdowns could be routine security adjustments. The language shift could be political signaling for domestic audiences. The reserve mobilization could be prudent contingency planning. But when all 5 signals activate simultaneously, within the same 3-week window, those alternative explanations collapse under their own weight. You have amphibious forced entry ships in position loaded with 2,200 Marines and armored vehicles. Ground force staging infrastructure expanding at 3 forward bases with construction matching occupation profiles, not air campaign profiles. Diplomatic personnel evacuating the region on ordered departure, matching the 30 to 45-day pre-invasion timeline from 2003, with allied governments mirroring the timeline within 48 hours. Political and media language transitioning from containment vocabulary to regime change vocabulary, and 18,000 reservists mobilized in 3 weeks, including engineer battalions and civil affairs units whose capabilities are relevant only to ground occupation. That is not 5 coincidences happening at the same time. That is a pattern. And it is the same pattern every single time. What does this mean for you personally? If American ground forces enter Iran, this conflict transforms from a regional air campaign into the largest American ground operation since 2003, except this time against a country with 4 times Iraq's population, vastly more difficult mountain terrain, a military doctrine designed from the ground up to bleed occupying forces through decentralized guerrilla resistance, and a geographic position controlling 20% of the world's daily oil supply through a 33-kilometer waterway that is already closed. The economic damage that has already arrived, gas prices up 80 cents in 2 weeks, fertilizer costs up 35%, the Dow down more than 3,000 points from its February high, Goldman Sachs recession probability at 25%, all of that becomes the floor, not the ceiling. A sustained ground war means the Strait of Hormuz stays closed for months, not weeks. Goldman Sachs projects oil reaching $170 to $200 per barrel in a prolonged ground conflict scenario. Defense spending would require congressional supplemental appropriations in the hundreds of billions. And occupying a mountainous nation of 90 million people would demand a force commitment that every serious military analyst compares unfavorably to Iraq. A war that consumed 20 years, cost over $2 trillion, and produced no strategic outcome that justified either figure. Mark Zandi, chief economist at Moody's, has already established that every sustained 1-cent increase in gasoline costs adds $1.4 billion in annual national spending. A ground war that pushes gas towards $7 or $8 per gallon, which falls within the range of credible projections if the strait remains closed for 6 months or longer, would represent the single largest involuntary wealth transfer from American consumers to energy markets in the country's history. Multiply that across 130 million American households and work through what that math means for the family in Ohio trying to make a mortgage payment, the retiree in Florida watching a fixed income buy less every single week, the small business owner in Texas whose fuel costs have already eaten into margins that were thin before any of this started. The honest assessment requires saying something uncomfortable. None of these 5 predictions guarantee that a ground invasion will happen. Military buildups can serve as coercive leverage designed to force a diplomatic outcome without firing a shot. Troop deployments can be authorized and then reversed. Political language can shift and shift again based on events. The purpose of laying out these 5 signals is not to tell you with certainty what will happen. It is to hand you a framework, the same framework that professional analysts use, so that you are not blindsided if and when preparation becomes execution. But the historical record is not ambiguous. When all 5 of these signals activated simultaneously in past conflicts, amphibious assets in theater, forward bases expanding, diplomatic evacuations ordered, regime change language deployed, and reserve forces mobilizing at scale, ground operations followed within 10 to 30 days. Not sometimes, not usually, every single time. Let me run through this one final time cleanly and clearly. Prediction 1. The naval deployment has moved beyond airstrike support into amphibious forced entry positioning, with the USS Bataan and 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit in the Gulf of Oman alongside the USS Arlington carrying additional Marines and armored vehicles. Prediction 2. Forward operating bases in Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE are expanding with ground force staging construction. The 101st Airborne has been placed